1997, change was everywhere.
Reports of my political demise were not in fact exaggerated.
18 years of Conservative government had come to an end.
Today, enough of talking. It is time now to do.
In September, Scotland voted yes, yes to a Scottish Parliament with tax-varying powers.
I think the mood in the country was one of incredible optimism.
And the legislation paving the way for a Scottish Parliament was published to much acclaim.
There shall be a Scottish Parliament. I like that.
The new constitutional order asserted that people, not Parliament, was sovereign. The parties set about winning hearts, minds, and above all, votes.
It's the first national election under proportional representation. In the Labour Party, we were acutely aware that having won so decisively in the UK, we were actually giving power away by committing ourselves to a PR parliament where it was unlikely that we would be in majority power.
Enterprise, fairness, democracy, that's how we summed up our manifesto. And then we had a series of policies, from scrapping tuition fees to keeping public services in public hands.
This was a new beginning. After many general elections, UK general elections, where we'd fought over whether we should have a parliament or not, this was one where we got the parliament. What were we now going to do with it?
There was a very clear obligation in the party to try and engage with voters and say, look, we're now for devolution, we accept the referendum result, and we now want to work with the electorate to produce a programme of deliverable commitments.
I don't think we expected to win, and I think we did a good job of reminding ourselves that actually we moved it was a huge strategic step forward for the SNP and therefore the case for independence.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Scottish New Labour's first campaign press conference in our new media centre here today.
Scottish Labour will continue the work of the new Labour government in prudently managing the Scottish economy.
The Labour campaign centred on the Scottish Secretary Donald Dewar. He was in a job he'd waited a lifetime for. Moderate, high on social democratic principle, and respected across the political divide. The term right place at the right time could have been coined for Labour's languid, likeable, lofty intellectual.
He did have public trust, and it was really important to not just portray him as a potential First Minister, but also to build up his profile, because he was going to be, if we won, in that post, and we wanted to make sure that he had the authority to not just govern Scotland, but speak for Scotland at that stage.
Donald really spent that campaign out on a bus, touring the entire country, being with the people, talking to people whose national leader we hoped he was about to become.
Oi, hold it.
Labour played a safety-first campaign, happy to bask in the afterglow of a Westminster landslide 2 years previously.
How are you doing?
4 in 5, 45.
2 and 8, 28. 6 and 7, 67.
In many ways, the Labour appeal to voters in '99 was a continuation of more of the same, but with decision-making closer to home. And it perhaps wasn't really until the 2003 election before the election really became about manifestos that were made in Scotland.
Yeah. I've seen you. I've got one of them to do.
All right, so we have a chance then?
Yeah, sure, you might be.
Good, thanks very much.
We thought we could win the election, and it's been a constant feature of the SNP in all my time in the party that even in elections where, if you look back objectively, we probably didn't have much of a chance of winning, we fought every election to win. So that's how we entered the '99 election.
What's your problem? Well, you don't up the street. Can you bring them back again? Yeah, bring them back. Bring them back.
If they were to make any headway, the SNP would have to take risks. And in Alex Salmond, they had a man not averse to a gamble.
Almost 50 years ago, NATO was formed as a defensive alliance against potential aggression from the Soviet Union. It achieved its primary purpose without firing a single shot, but now for the first time it is acting in an offensive capacity out with any specific remit from the United Nations. It is an action of dubious legality, but above all one of unpardonable folly.
His now infamous Kosovo broadcast, delivered just before campaigning started, was designed to cast him in the role of politician of high principle, but it put him on the back foot almost immediately.
You know, from his perspective, he was seeking to make sure that a different voice was heard in the debate, and therefore we weren't drowned out in what was the #1 issue of the time. But there's no doubt that that was a difficult one on the doorsteps.
Staggered by it. I mean, no one warms or likes the idea of military action. But what was going on in Kosovo was unconscionable. The threat there were to thousands, tens of thousands of refugees. And though it was a difficult decision for the government, I believed it was the right decision.
Well, I think we were horrified, just because it did seem such a shocking gaffe. Did he really believe that NATO intervening to stop Serb aggression was an act of unpardonable folly?
The top story tonight at 6.
A Scotland Today poll shows Scots failing to back Salmond, but the SNP leader is standing by his opposition to NATO airstrikes.
Man's a clown. He just said he wasn't in Clydebank during the Blitz, that's all I can say.
I think it's absolutely ridiculous. They had to go in.
He was saying what other people perhaps feel.
While in Glasgow, a peaceful demonstration organised by Yugoslavians but supported by all nationalities called for a halt to the bombing.
The headlines were, supporting Milosevic, the toast of Belgrade, and that is how people then judged the argument. And so in a sense, it was the characterisation of what he said that became the issue in the campaign rather than the substance. Did it change the outcome of the election? I don't think so.
On the verge of a national election, it put him on the back foot.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that he politically was a person who was prepared to bear risk in order to move things forward, and that didn't always pay off for him.
Attempting to outflank Labour on a progressive agenda, the SNP proposed a tax increase for public services, their so-called penny for Scotland.
The SNP signalled today that they intend to make tax a key election issue, and that will suit both Labour and the Conservatives, who believe that the penny for Scotland policy is a distinctive vote loser.
I think it firstly was to demonstrate and use that as a way of symbolising that social democratic left of centre platform that we were standing on. Secondly, it was very much about trying to demonstrate one of the points of having a parliament, the difference a parliament could make and the different decisions it could take. And there was also a sense of trying to seize the agenda.
And I've turned it down, right? I've turned it down for party, for the sake of party.
It's actually a double-headed one.
I think it certainly got cut through. I think the mistake was that we hadn't really articulated what we were going to do with the money so well, so we hadn't created the upside, but we had talked a lot about the downside, which was to tax. It did mark the SNP out as social democratic and different, not going through with the norm. But it did feel at the time that it was a bit late in the day, I think it's fair to say.
The SNP's divorce means more tax.
There was a real strong feeling, I think, across the sort of political and media establishment in Scotland in the 1990s that Scots were up for more taxation, more public spending, regardless of the consequences. And I think the SNP decision to go for Penny for Scotland really was based on that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we have the bed tax.
The first Scottish Conservative leader, David McCletchie, was an unknown quantity. He had little profile and was leading a party that had lost office in the UK and was seen as out of touch on the Home Rule question.
That David was pitted against three seasoned, well-known, very competent politicians: Donald Dewar, Alex Salmond and Jim Wallace. And I think many people thought that David would be the inexperienced, slightly at sea, not quite in the same league as these three tried and tested, political beasts. In fact, David proved everyone wrong.
Scotland's new parliament was to be elected by proportional representation, meaning that Labour, the favourites to be the largest party, would need a coalition partner. The Lib Dems were hounded during the campaign with one question: would they do a deal with Donald Dewar?
I'm talking today about bringing this campaign to a successful conclusion by winning seats. Matters on what happens post-election will be dealt with post-election.
I suspect towards the end of the campaign you were getting bored hearing that answer, and it did probably get you onto some other things. And the other thing is that the more people who voted Liberal Democrat, the more likely it was that in any parliament where we had a sizable number, the more Liberal Democrat MSPs, the more likely we were to get more of our manifesto implemented. And we stuck pretty rigidly to these lines, to the extent of probably boring people, journalists like yourself. But the other positive side of it was that we were seen to be relevant.
When it became clear during the election campaign itself, not afterwards but during it, that it was likely that there would be a parliament without an overall majority, then some of the issues that would form part of the negotiations became really key to the last few days of the election campaign.
The campaign TV debates were businesslike, and the divisions between the parties rarely brought bad-tempered exchanges.
A new way forward for Scotland. All the parties have been involved. I believe that we are on the threshold of a new era. It will be up to the parties after May the 7th to prove that to the Scots. I've no doubt we'll deliver.
Perhaps there was something after all about change, ushering in a new, less confrontational politics. The new electoral system also promised hope for independence. Dennis Canavan stood in Falkirk West after Labour refused to put him on their panel of prospective candidates.
I had the support of over 97% of the party members in my constituency on a one-member, one-vote basis. Over 97%, and yet you had this situation where the three men and a dog could outnumber all of my constituency party members. And I thought that was quite insulting to the constituency Labour Party, and even more insulting to the people of Falkirk West constituency who had voted me and re-elected me over a period of a quarter of a century or more.
We want a parliament of consensus, and the Green Party within that parliament would argue on an issue-by-issue basis.
The Scottish Socialist Party, like the Scottish Greens, hoped that any elected MSPs could wield real influence in a parliament where no one party would have an overall majority.
We are standing in every one of the 8 regional lists in Scotland.
But most of the attention was on the established parties. The polls pointed to a Labour victory. The SNP campaign hit a low when they found it difficult to quantify the extent of the deficit an independent Scotland might run.
We lay it out in terms of the appendices, just look it up and read the figure out.
Yeah, but we haven't got the worst case figure for the next financial year.
Our assumptions are set out in page 29.
I have to ask you about that famous press conference. I think it was in the Moat House
I wasn't at it.
in Glasgow.
I saw it on television.
What did you make of it when you saw it?
It wasn't our finest hour, I think it's fair to say.
The people in Scotland are right to have the figure from you. Everything here is very clear if you read it. Would have journalists here want an answer to that question.
The leader looked to the right to me and said, "Will you answer it then?" And of course I had to quickly try and work it out, and it wasn't. It did not look orderly. It was not professional. I don't look back on it with fondness.
Well, if you take 869 and subtract 2.5 billion, you'll get what? Just off the top of my head, you're better put in 1.7 billion.
1.7 billion, which is not any form of structural deficit in Scotland, which, as Andrew rightly says, is a superior position to the UK.
We were under a degree of scrutiny that we'd never been under before, and I think generally we stood up to that pretty well, but you know, it was a new experience for all, even for Alec, the most seasoned and experienced of all of us. I think that was a level of scrutiny that even he hadn't been used to.
The picture sort of said to folk, they've not done their homework, they can't be trusted with government. That's certainly how Labour saw it.
Yeah, And I think that criticism is probably valid. It wasn't, you know, I'm now laughing about it, now remembering how it felt at the time, not laughing so much inside. No, there's no doubt that that was a big lesson learned for, you know, I don't want to say it wasn't entirely my fault. It wasn't entirely my fault, but certainly it was largely my fault, I suppose. And that's something we've taken into the, you know, right the way through what happened next, is you've got to prepare rigorously for everything. And, you know, very recent history, I think, proves that.
I think it was a turning point in the campaign, because that first Scottish Parliament election campaign was in many ways a proxy for, was the right solution for Scotland to have its own parliament in the United Kingdom and with new influence in Europe, or was the right strategy for the parliament simply to be a staging post to Scotland walking out of the UK. They were the terms of reference, and when it came to judgment on economic plans on that occasion, the SNP were found wanting.
Tony Blair headed north and could smell an SNP campaign in trouble. His verbal assault cemented Alex Salmond's reputation as a cheeky chappie.
It is a balance sheet that assumes that a separate Scotland will, in its first year, receive £1.8 billion in North Sea oil revenue, which is more than is forecast this year for the whole of Britain. And it is a balance sheet that assumes that the windfall tax actually yields Scotland £100 million more than it paid in. Now, that's just with an hour or so to go.
Was the media campaign against you relentless?
It was relentless, and there was a sense, and okay, I'm articulating this from the perspective of somebody who was, you know, very much on the receiving end of that, but it felt as if the media in that campaign were doing more than just putting us under the scrutiny that any party should expect in a campaign. They were almost trying to destroy us in that campaign and test us to destruction, with the emphasis being on destruction. Now, I think we came through that really well, but it was tough, and it was, you know, a daily onslaught.
The reason why the nationalists are so strong in Scotland, even if they don't win next week in any way, they are still very strong compared to the time when I was a kid, because they've had a compliant and friendly nationalism media with a small n in this country. The broadcasters, just as much as the newspapers in this country, have created the conditions in the past 20 years which have allowed nationalism to flourish. They have emphasised Scottish identity at the cost of British identity.
There was a sense that not all journalists by any stretch of the imagination, but that some journalists were almost doing Labour's job for them. They were putting the lines and the attack lines that Labour were setting up the lines, and they were being delivered by some journalists.
As the campaign entered the home straight, it was pretty clear that Labour would win and the SNP would come second. The only real question, how big would the gap be?
I fully expected Labour to be the largest party, because just remember where we were. Tony Blair was coming up to the second anniversary of his election. He was still riding high in opinion polls. There was still an aura about the Blair government, which, you know, was bound to translate itself, because Scotland was one of the, you know, the pillars of that Labour government.
Polling day arrived, and another historical day at a time when these days seem to abound.
Thursday, May the 6th, 1999, a day which changed the course of Scottish history as we voted for our own Parliament for the first time in 300 years.
I declare that Tom McCabe is elected as the first member of the Scottish Parliament. 16,600.
18,511. Sure, Scottish Labour Party, 16,749 votes.
Scottish politics are forever changed.
Keir Hardie was elected at the end of the last century, and the colour of this last century has been socialism. The next century, the colour of it for the future of the world has to be green.
Fourth is William Aiken, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
We now have a Conservative at Holyrood.
Yes, well, that's splendid, isn't it?
It's taken us 7 hours,
Yeah,
25 minutes and 37 seconds.
This is a 100% improvement on the position I was in a studio at the last general election.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party is back. We are going to be the third force in Scottish politics.
And Nicola Sturgeon, Scottish National Party, 9,665 votes. I hereby declare that Gordon Jackson is duly elected to serve as a member of the Scottish Parliament for Govan's constituency.
He had been elected as one of 129 members of this first Parliament in 300 years. It was historic. And yet, in that moment, and for the couple of days after that, my overwhelming feeling was one of disappointment that I hadn't won the constituency.
Nicola Sturgeon, you expected to win Govan and you didn't.
Well, I hope to win, and I'm disappointed that we haven't. It took me a bit of time to get over that, and I suppose when I look back personally, that's kind of what I remember and how odd that all felt for a while.
But I think the more significant underlying current was the share of the vote, because of course this was a PR election, and those of us who were the anoraks of psephology, as you indeed are, Bernard, there was a sense that we knew that the share of the vote indicated what we knew, that since really the early 90s, Scotland had been at least a four-party system.
The turnout nationally for the first election to the Scottish Parliament was less than 60%. In my constituency, it was a bit over 60%, but not much. So I was disappointed. In fact, at one stage, I was worried. I really thought that the low turnout would mean that my chances of winning were diminished.
William McClenchie, Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party.
I think it was very much to David's credit that he, as leader, at the end of that campaign, had produced 18 Conservative MSPs for that new Parliament.
I think quite a lot of people would have been initially a wee bit disappointed. That more, part of being a political campaigner is you have to always be optimistic and hope for more. But I think on reflection, definitely satisfied. I mean, it really felt good when a substantial opposition group went into Holyrood.
In 1999, Labour won 56 seats as against 35 for the SNP. The Scottish Conservatives won 18, the Liberal Democrats 17, and 1 each for the Greens and Scottish Socialists. Dennis Canavan, of course, was elected as an independent. Almost immediately, Labour and the Liberal Democrats started negotiations with a view to forming a coalition government.
I think a coalition was absolutely needed in those first 4 years to make sure that the Parliament could not just stabilise, but get on with its business, start to legislate, agree budgets, and make sure that it served the people of Scotland and didn't just become a battleground for the politicians.
Jim Wallace, who of course was leading with the Liberals, has a fantastic anecdote where they are sitting together and trying to put together a coalition, and the advisors had come up with the proposals of the Labour Party and the proposals of the Liberal Democrats, trying to put them together, and Donald described, "What's this piece of nonsense here?" And Jim Wallace turns to him and says, "That's a piece of Labour nonsense, Donald."
Scottish Liberal Democrat leader Jim Wallace left his party's Edinburgh headquarters this morning for the first face-to-face negotiations with Donald Dewar.
We'll have to see how we get on, but we want it to work, but we may not, but we'll give it our best shot. I can remember at least 2 occasions during the coalition talks when I folded over my notepad and said, "Well, sorry, Donald, I think we've given this our best try. I just don't think it's going to work," and left. And then we'd try. Folk call me back and we'd try again later, and eventually it did work. But it was never a given.
Labour and the Liberal Democrats formed a coalition as the era of a new politics arrived.
Jim and myself, can confirm that agreement has been reached between Labour and the Liberal Democrat groups in the Scottish Parliament.
This historic agreement will ensure that Scotland's first Parliament for 300 years will make a difference for all of the people of Scotland.
It was now time for the new Parliament to get down to work. Full legislative powers were devolved on the 1st of July, 1999.
We are fallible. We all know that. We'll make mistakes. But I hope and I believe we will never lose sight of what brought us here. The striving to do right by the people of Scotland, to respect their priorities, to better their lot, and to contribute to the common weal.
And that was a remarkably historically generous speech that he gave. You know, he really gave everyone a stake in the story. He anchored it in the history of how we'd got to where we were, and really challenged the politicians to step up.
For him, politics was always about righting the social arithmetic, he called it. And by righting the social arithmetic, he meant that a child's life chances shouldn't be determined by the circumstances of their birth.
And the rest, as they say, is history. The early years of the Parliament was dominated by the scandal of the Holyrood building project. Donald Dewar died in 2000. His successor lasted a year. Jack McConnell steadied the good ship Devolution. And then in 2007, a real watershed moment, the SNP win the general election. 4 years later, they bust the system by forming a majority administration. By 2014, Scotland looks on the verge of independence. But as the late Donald Dewar used to remind us, devolution is a process, not an event. The story of Scotland's Parliament continues.
We're embarking on a process which will have as its destination the implementation of free personal care for all.
We will, with your support, introduce a comprehensive ban on smoking in enclosed public places. And we have a clear signal that Scotland has changed.
I'm honoured to announce that on Thursday, the 18th of September 2014, we will hold Scotland's referendum, a historic day where the people will decide Scotland's future.
Regardless of your politics or your point of view, my job is to serve you. I hope that my election as First Minister does indeed help to open the gate to greater opportunity for all women.
You know, for my generation, we still think of and remember and talk about the pre-Scottish Parliament days, but it always strikes me when I speak to school pupils, which I do a lot, and if I ever find myself talking about the days before the Scottish Parliament, they just look at you blankly, as if, what are you talking about? That there was ever a time when we didn't have this Parliament. And the fact that so quickly it became so established, and it's unthinkable that it wouldn't exist, is probably the greatest success of all.